Rachel on Colourful Radio.
Welcome to She Power on Colourful Radio. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. Really happy to be back with you. I am, of course, Rachel, your host for the next 2 hours. And today, I'm really happy to introduce our guest to you. Her name is Shahroo Izadi. She is a behavioural change specialist and best-selling author. She's released 2 books, The Kindness Method and The Last Diet. She's also a therapist at Amy's House, which is a recovery house for women set up by the Amy Winehouse Foundation. She has extensive experience in treating individuals with all kinds of addictions. And it's really great to have you with us today, Shahroo. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. Very well indeed. What an intro.
Well, it's your intro. It's your truth.
Thank you very much.
I mean, you've been working for many years with people who are battling all kinds of addictions. For those who don't know you, what inspired you to get into this line of work and how did you get started?
I think, to be fair to a lot of the people who've put in way more time than I have, it's been about 8 years in total that I've worked either in wellbeing and habit change or in substance misuse. And truth be told, I started off, I finished an undergrad and a postgrad in psychology, and I needed to do a placement, and I wasn't very academic, and I was kind of thinking, what am I truly interested in? And addiction always fascinated me. So I applied for some placements, and I did it based on, not what I wanted to study as much as who I wanted to learn about. And I wanted to be in front of people and see real stories immediately. So, I started working in substance misuse and I never looked back. I started working with the NHS in a clinical capacity, just as an assistant psychologist. And then I got a job as a key worker. And then after that, I started training staff who work with people in addiction and helping them with tools that they can use in their day-to-day lives and evidence-based that will help them to help other people and also to take care of themselves. And so there were all these overlaps. And eventually I just realized all of this stuff is so useful to the general population and needn't be associated with addiction or indeed anything remedial. Like, these are just well-being tools. The approaches being used in addiction treatment clinically in prisons, etc. These are all just very well-informed, back to basics, efficient tools. And I wanted to make them available to the general population. So long story short, that ended up becoming the Kindness Method, which was inspired by all that stuff that I saw.
That's amazing. And you also had your own journey, didn't you, with, not addiction to an abusive substance, but issues surrounding food and, I guess, body image. Would you say that? Or how would you define it?
I mean, I would say it was abuse. I'd say it was an addiction. In my case, when it came to the way I was eating, I was in a very extreme binge restrict cycle, more binging than restricting, I would say. And I was being very cruel to myself, very cruel to my body. My weight would fluctuate. I'm talking like 6 to 8 stone at a time. And then I would go on these crash diets and do all these horrible, everything I possibly could, from going to different gurus to going to different doctors to having procedures, literally anything I could do to just try and lose weight. It was my number one mission, and all my self-worth was wrapped up in how much I weighed and how I looked. And it wasn't until I came across these tools, these self-compassion tools, that I started to separate what I was worth with how I looked, etc., but also started to understand how I could better manage the habits that were causing me to become unhappy. And so, they've been transformative in my case. And I think actually that's one of the things that's made me connect with readers and clients and workshop attendees the most, is the fact that I really have lived this stuff. And I actually find it quite difficult to implement change a lot of the time. And so I can really relate to other people who do as well.
Getting back to addictions, and there are so many different types of addictions. For some, it's social media. For some, it's, substances, whatever it might be. In your experience, would you say there are some key factors that increase the likelihood of somebody becoming addicted? For example, we hear this term sometimes, the addictive personality. Do you reckon people are born with these types of personalities that are inclined to becoming addicts later on in life? Or is this a learned behavior? Or is it a bit of both?
Yeah, I recommend checking out people like Gabor Mate, Johan Hari, people who speak specifically on addiction, who are far more qualified than I am. I have found that whilst in the reading that I've done around addictive personality, I found that it's not as simple as that. And that, yes, there are, when it comes to self-regulation, when it comes to impulse control, when it comes to stress, there seem to be certain things that can be passed on, but you can't guess who will become an addict by any means. And a lot of the time with these things, with the little that I know in this particular, that specific area, I do tend to use the term nature via nurture. And that there is a complex interaction between both that will be taking place in every person who's had a unique experience. And I think a lot of the time, the way that we look at substances is more of or substance misuse is that it's more of a problem than a solution. And when we look at what problem it's actually solving, a lot of the time we can come back to understanding the person better and their needs and where they've come from and where they were starting off.
That makes sense. And it seems like a more compassionate way to look at it as well, trying to understand the person as a whole rather than just focusing perhaps on the label that's been put on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people unfairly assume or give up on stuff or give up on themselves because they assume that they have an all or nothing personality, or they assume they have an addictive personality or whatever it is, when actually I think a lot of the time, whether or not that transpires to continue to be true and validated in different ways and different research, a lot of the time we just don't even have the tools to even start asking the questions of how we would change that or attempting to change that before we brand ourselves with these kinds of things. And I think that's because a fundamental part of life is going to be adapting, changing, creating new habits, creating new routines, and yet for some reason that doesn't seem to be part of our education.
It's funny that, isn't it? Because like you're saying, this method, which I'll talk about in a second, that you've created, the kindness method, is sharing tools of well-being with people, regardless of their background. Now, you would think that these important tools that you're sharing with us would be told to us when we're like 10 years old or 12 or 14 or what, whatever that age may be, before we step out into the big wide world and we would know how to self-regulate.
Yeah. Impulse control. These are all things we're going to need in our real lives. The ability to bounce back, to believe in ourselves, to have tools that remind us of how capable we are in moments where we don't want to believe it ourselves. These are so important. We're taught to apply for universities. I remember when I was at school, we had a whole afternoon every week in upper sixth, where we had, or lower sixth, or whatever, whenever it is, that you have to start doing UCAS forms, right? We never got anything around, this is how you deal with rejection.
Exactly.
There was nothing around that. And this is how you identify what your values are. This is the sort of life you actually want to live. And the other thing is, we have no problem collecting examples of how we've thrived and demonstrated how capable we are when it comes to academics or professional development. In our private lives and our personal and emotional development, we don't seem to have the same sort of framework. We don't check in and kind of say, wow, I got through a really tough year and that helps me define myself in this way now. What we do instead a lot of the time is carry around these core beliefs from when we're young and not update them. So I think all of these things it would be so lovely if schools and earlier on we'd had things like this. And so people wouldn't come to think, oh, I have an addictive personality, before they've had a chance to try out a few things that might give them more insight into why they're finding something seemingly simple so difficult to change.
Exactly. Oh. Anyway, you developed the kindness method in order to help people to overcome all kinds of addictions or create the change that they want to see in their lives after using the method on yourself. For those who don't know, can you explain to us what the kindness method is?
The kindness method is everything I found useful when I was working in addiction and using stuff on myself, stripped down into exercises and guidance so that people can pick a habit they want to change and answer some questions and do some exercises. And by the end of it, have a plan of change and believe in their capacity to change. That's what it helps people to do. So I just kept anything that I found was useful, that other people found was useful, that I saw working on the ground. I stripped it down, workshopped it, and I eventually just turned it into a process that people go through as quickly as they'd like, because it's in a book. With the experience being that you were with me basically for 3 or 4 hours, and I talked you through a bunch of exercises and drew out all that insight. But it's even better than if you were with me, because we don't have to build a rapport, so you can go straight to being honest. And that was a huge thing for me. I want people to feel like they can be honest from the get-go, and for that I think that it's useful to have it be a private process. And so it's essentially that. It's just a bunch of exercises that are designed to help you get where you want to be.
One thing that strikes me about your method and about your book as well is just how non-judgmental it is, as is evident in the title. For instance, something that you state in your book is that being kind to yourself, whether or not you can achieve your goals, actually helps you achieve them more quickly. Why do you think that is? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a few reasons. I think one is that a lot of the time people say, when I achieve this goal, I will reward myself with this thing that makes me feel good. But until I achieve this goal, I'm not worthy of that. So, and a lot of the time that will be self-care things like I will treat myself by taking better care of myself. When I look like this, when I've achieved this, I'll be the kind of person who takes those walks and drinks that water and wears those bright colors and takes those risks and applies for that job. I honestly believe that if we take our lives off hold and we make kindness and joy unconditional, then that feeling, it will help us to change habits. If you think about habit change is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And it's easier to do difficult things when you feel good. It's as simple as that. It's easier to stay on track when things are difficult. The other thing is, a huge part of this is that so often when we want to change habits, what we focus on is our plan, the color coding and this is my meticulous plan, this is what I'm going to do. And what we don't think about is what we're going to do when we go off track with our plan, which we inevitably will. We put too much faith in the plan and not enough faith in ourselves. And so I think it's really important that we assume that there will be moments where our plans don't go to plan, and look at those as opportunities to really listen in on the way that we speak to ourselves. That's when you notice the power of compassion. When you're trying to do something difficult and you choose to listen in on the way that you speak to yourself, very often people will be absolutely shocked to hear the sorts of messages they're giving themselves. Now, not only are they things like that you don't deserve to hear and are probably outdated core beliefs from childhood, as I mentioned earlier. It might be something a teacher told you when you were 12, like, oh, you're just the sort of person who starts things and doesn't finish them, or you're just lazy, or whatever else. Now, aside from the fact that us telling ourselves those things when we're finding things tough is just not the way we deserve to live, it's really unhelpful. Because if I asked you now to motivate someone to get back on track with a difficult plan of behavioural change, I would guess that the messages you would choose to give them would not be, you're so weak, you may as well give up, you should just start on Monday again.
Exactly.
Point, you're not the sort of person who can do stuff like this. You would be like, you've got this, think of all the other difficult stuff you've done, how can I help you, you're amazing, it's just a blip. So if we can learn to speak that way for ourselves, then what we eventually can build is this 24-hour cheerleader. And that's my ambition for people, is to help them. Is the buy-in is there. Initially when I read about the self-compassion and all this stuff, I wanted to make practical changes. And so to be honest with you, it took results to make me realize, wow, this self-compassion stuff is really worth it. Even if I don't believe that I'm worth it yet, in terms of making changes, this being nice to your stuff is not messing about. It gets stuff done. Because what it makes you do also, being nice, being kind to yourself, there's another aspect of this. When we give people advice, kind advice, when we love them, it's not always the easy advice. We give them the kind of advice to make the choice that they'll be glad they made tomorrow, to make the choice that they would tell someone else to make if they loved them, to make the choice that the smartest person they know would tell them to make. It's not always the easy choice. So I think a lot of the simplicity and the common sense comes back to self-compassion, because we all know how to give compassion to other people. We all know how to advise our loved ones to excel. And we have that script and we have that capacity. I think it really is my job is to close that gap. And the sort of habit change becomes the sort of Trojan horse. I say to people, look, I'm telling you why it's compelling to like yourself more. And be nicer to yourself. It's going to get stuff done faster. And then once you're there and stuff's got done, then obviously you're also enjoying the fact that you like yourself more.
I mean, where do you think that gap comes from? Because it's quite amazing how so many of us go through this, right? Where we have to learn how to be kind to ourselves. Like, where does that internal bully, as you describe it, come from? And I know, okay, fine, people say stuff when we're younger, but is it just people speaking over us, or is it just the society that we live in that is somehow subliminally putting pressure on us? Like, it's quite amazing how many of us struggle in this area.
I think all of those things apply, sadly. And the boring reality of these kinds of conversations, as we said with the addiction bit, is that it's annoyingly muddy and everyone's so complex with it and everything. And it's all of these things together. I do think that there are a few main ones. Yeah, media doesn't help. These sort of finding new things wrong with us that we have to pay to fix doesn't help. There is also the fact that we don't know the way that other people are thinking. So one of the greatest gifts, I guess, that I've been given in the job that I have is that I'm finally realizing that I'm not the exception. I'm not the worst. And I think we all, until we can all be a bit more vulnerable, and we're, it's all moving in the right direction. These words, vulnerability, authenticity, these are all over the shop now, which is fantastic. And I think until we can all get more and more honest about what challenges we're facing ourselves and see other people who are facing the same challenges as us and see how we speak to them, that we can start asking the question of why not me then? Why don't I deserve the same thing? But I think, all of these things have come together to make it so that the sad reality is that it's notable when someone's open about loving themselves. Do you remember at school, the worst thing you could be accused of was loving yourself? And now everyone's going going to TED Talks, help me love myself. It's like the number one thing we all know. We all know how important it is. We all know how it would make our lives better. We all know how it would help us to love others and be better partners and better colleagues and all of this stuff. But there is a resistance there. And I think it is also that. It's that whole, like, who do you think you are going around saying you love yourself? I don't think that helps.
Because people sometimes do that, especially when, people want to change and they want to become a better version of themselves. Sometimes that makes other people in their immediate circle feel threatened, right? And ask them, who do you think you are? What do you think you're doing? You think really highly of yourself.
Yeah, I mean, look, I won't lie to you. I spent so many years being... thinking that just by existing, I didn't have enough value. So I had to do stuff for people and I had to go above and beyond and I had to be everything for everyone and not really need anything in return. And it made me all sorts of things that I wasn't happy with. I became quite controlling and insular or just all sorts of things I didn't want to be. And as I began to change through these kinds of exercises, I became more boundaried. I began to know my worth. I began to know the worth of the value of my time and the value of myself. I had some people who didn't want to be my friend anymore. And granted, it comes out in different cracks in different ways, but you can kind of tell that there are some people who rely on a certain dynamic in a relationship, whether or not they want to admit it. And when they start noticing, with their position becomes threatened as a knock-on effect of not being able to bounce off where you are, if you know what I mean.
So true. It's such an important statement.
So I get it. It's hurtful. Don't get me wrong. I've cried a bunch of tears, but eventually I think a lot of people have that story too. I mean, look, this is just me with a bunch of school friends. You could talk to people who have had to move out of entire neighborhoods, because of their addictions and the fact that people won't allow them to have change. I think a lot of the time with long friendships as well, when I look at the friendships that have really stood the test of time, we've all allowed each other to change over and over and over again and encouraged that change and had our own changes going on. I think that's really important.
That's a really good quality for everybody listening to look out for in your own friendships. Who are the people in your life that encourage you to change and give you the freedom to express yourself in your most authentic way? Have a think about that. Really, really good point, Shahroo. One of the exercises in your book that I personally have been doing is keeping a list of all the things that I am proud of that I've done. It's small, little, but actually it's a really good list to go back to and refer to. Tell us about this practice.
It's just that I can't believe how often I'll speak to someone who doesn't believe in themselves, and then I, with the little knowledge that I have of them, will be able to give them an enormous boost by simply relaying back to them, reminding them of all the extraordinary things that they've managed to do and get through. I've also noticed that there are sometimes, there are things that we find that we know were huge for us and made huge shifts in terms of how capable we felt, but to other people aren't that big a deal. So, for example, in my book, there's an example of one of my clients who ran marathons, but she was more proud of the fact that she was proud of that. But when it came to making a list of stuff she was proud of herself for, she knew in her heart of hearts that the thing she was most proud of herself for was that she had gone through a really stressful period, and for the first time in her life, she hadn't dealt with it by drinking more wine in the evening. Now, in her life, that's harder than a marathon. That will never be the case for me. I cannot stress enough. But in my case, another example is, I've written these books and I loved writing them. I wouldn't say I found it harder or that I'm more proud of that challenge as I am the challenge of having learned how to deal better with my codependency or with my anxiety. So I think that there should be a place where we can just write down every now and then, do a little recap on the week. What am I proud of myself for? Because not only does that draw out a tool that you can glance at the next time you're doubting yourself and see 50 things that you're amazing at or that you've managed to do or get through. That's one thing. But what it also helps do a lot of the time is kind of draw out your values and the things that you identify motivate you the most personally, by noticing the things that when you're totally honest with yourself, you can say, that was tough for me. Maybe not for everyone else, but that was tough for me. And this is a conversation that I have with people around eating habits all the time, because very often they want to change their eating habits, and the people around them who perhaps don't have the same emotional or ingrained relationship with food can simply not understand. They trivialize the whole thing because we're talking about food, for example. And yet I know a number of people who would say that they would find it considerably harder to change their relationship with food than with alcohol. So I think we need a space where we can personally identify what makes us feel motivated, what makes us feel pumped. And I just think it's really as simple as that. Every now and then, when you think of something you're proud of yourself for, you notice a new response, you notice a shift, you've done something in my case, it'll be things like I didn't reply to that email straight away. Stuff like
exactly.
that.
Yeah, but all these things matter, right?
Right, yeah, and they matter to us individually. And I think a lot of the time it's about us not looking outward to say to people, am I capable? Am I this? Am I that? And more asking yourself and drawing those answers out. And honestly, aside from anything else, when you're doubting your capacity to do anything, even if it's wake up a bit earlier in the morning, if you could just glance at that first, the conversation that comes up in your head is, well, if I could do this, then I can do this. And absolutely. I think it's really powerful and it's cheap and you can do it. You can write it on your hand for all I care. It's so easy to do.
And also, I think, sometimes we don't realize that we can do things because we want other people to be proud of us. We want to please our parents, or we want, our social circle to be proud of us. But when you can actually be proud of yourself without anybody knowing why, anybody else, being involved in that conversation, it's a really powerful position to be in, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that in my case has also extended to taking an opinion on something. Like if I used to have a problem or something I wasn't sure of that I wanted to talk out, and say I asked 3 people for their advice, I would assume that I was picking from 3 different options. I never once thought, well, what do I think I should do? Before I go to everyone else, if this decision was really on me, what do I instinctively think is the right choice? And so when I ask 3 people now, I'm left with 4 options. And I think that's really important too, is giving ourselves the credit of saying, my opinion of this matters too, and my opinion of myself matters. And what I do when no one's looking matters. That's a huge thing for a lot of people too. How I behave when no one's looking matters to me because I'm looking.
That's so true. And I don't know about you, but I used to always, if I would go to people for advice, I would, for whatever reason, think that their answer or their solution was better than mine. I don't know why I used to do that. I don't know if you can relate, or if anyone listening can relate. Yeah. But I would assume that they knew more, they knew the right way. And then when it didn't go the right way, I'd be like, oh my gosh, I was right all along.
Yeah. My version of that is when someone something's gone wrong, like say a meeting time or there's a glitch somewhere. Well, you and I found it the other week.
Yes.
I immediately took responsibility for that. Now, I don't know anything about tech. I don't know that it was my fault. I don't know that it was your fault. Frankly, I don't care. But I immediately assumed responsibility for whatever had gone wrong. And the same goes for, I have to really check myself. I have to really check myself when I read an email and someone says, hey, are you sure you got this right? Before I write back and just a million apologies before I've even checked. I'm so sorry. No, I'm terrible. I have to, so I have to check myself there. And yeah, I can completely relate to that. And just assuming other people's opinions of something are so much more important. And more and more, I think where we're putting stuff on the internet, we've got to be a bit more discerning about that. We've really got to have a criteria for the opinions that are going to matter, or else any old person with like some clown face profile picture is going to ruin our day.
Most definitely. So true. How would you say you make decisions today, bearing all that in mind? Do you take time to be quiet, or have you just like developed a really strong sense of self?
Oh, I wouldn't go that far. I'm work in progress. Do you know what I do? I take life choice by choice in the direction of being proud of myself tomorrow.
That's good.
I used to be really zoomed in. My friend tells me all the time that I live every day like it's like, not like the last in a sort of epic, write it on a pillow kind of way, but in that I would just exhaust every single day and not think about the impact it was going to have on tomorrow. And for me, it's been just projecting a couple of days. Like on a Friday, I think, how do I want to feel on Monday? On a Monday, I think, how do I want to feel on Friday? And that's kind of like, now I'm thinking, how do I want to feel the day after Christmas?
I love that you're asking, how do I want to feel, rather than what am I going to do? Is that intentional?
Yeah, because what am I going to do comes from how do I want to feel?
Okay.
And then I'm chasing how I want to feel, as opposed to what's going to give me a perceived idea of productivity or whatever else. And then it's also more compelling to chase how you want to feel.
Definitely.
So if I want to feel proud, I want to feel productive. Right, what do I need to have done to feel proud and productive? I want to feel calm. I want to feel positive. I want to feel mischievous. I want to feel, whatever it is. And then I work backwards from there, and I take it choice by choice. And it's extraordinary when you give yourself that tiny bit of intention, how much you start tweaking your choices. Like, you might think on a Sunday night, actually, I'm not going to have a glass of wine because tomorrow's this is the sort of domino effect it's going to have on tomorrow. And that was something that I didn't have before and helps me enormously now. And so I don't do plans as much as I do kind of like, okay, what is the next choice I need to make that will move me in that direction? And when the other thing is, I think some people call it fooling yourself, making excuses, justifications. It's just an escape of discomfort. But I think I've kind of exhausted the number of excuses that I make now. And I can really observe them with compassion as a natural and necessary part of change. So now if I'm trying to make a change, I'll expect to make excuses throughout the day. I'll expect to talk myself out of it. And I'll observe that and kind of go, oh yeah, it's about 11, so I'm probably telling myself that I should get up and do this, and actually it's not that important that I'm productive. And oh yeah, it's about 2, and I'm scrolling on Instagram. Like, it's almost like there's a separation, and I've been able to impose that space between wanting to do something and actually following through with it. That's probably been one of the greatest gifts, because it does mean that I can take things choice by choice and trust myself and make deal with spontaneous challenge a lot better. Because I used to just try and manage every possible outcome, and that's how I would keep myself safe. But what ended up happening was that I didn't trust myself very much. So I needed to see myself get challenged out of the blue to notice that this stuff was working. And yeah, it does. Luckily.
Well, it's great because you walk your talk, and that's really important. How would you define self-sabotage, and how can somebody overcome the temptation of self-sabotage?
There are some really good books on this around self-worth and believing you're actually worthy of achieving the stuff you want to achieve and not putting yourself in your own way. And there's a lot of people who kind of realize that if they achieved, consciously or otherwise, if I achieve this goal, then what else is that going to mean that I have to do? Am I worthy of that kind of success? Can I sit with it? All of that kind of stuff. That's one side of it, which there are some great books about. I actually really recommend Hazel Gale's book, the mind monster solution for that. In my world, a lot of people think they're sabotaging themselves, when in fact what they've done is really underestimate how difficult it is to change. They think that because they have the desire and the knowledge and and they know what the negatives of their behaviors are, that they should be able to change. And then they think that if I'm not doing those things, then why am I sabotaging myself? And I don't necessarily think we need to jump straight to sabotage before we think, well, is it possible that you've wildly underestimated your relationship with this substance, or you've wildly underestimated how ingrained this pattern is, and so you have not put things in place, assuming that once the novelty of change has worn off, or once your motivation wavers, then you're invariably going to want to revert back to the status quo and what you're comfortable with, even if what you're comfortable with isn't giving you positives in your life. It's what you know. So I think a lot of the time when people come and they say, why am I sabotaging myself? Because I know that I know I'd be healthier. I know it would be better for me and my family, and yet I continue to do this. I think what tends to happen is that they've demonized the behavior and they've focused only on the bad elements of the behavior and not actually on what that behavior is doing for them and why they're finding it so difficult to break a pattern. Not only can that foster more self-compassion and understanding, it can also help you to understand what other stuff you can put into place to make it so that you're less likely to engage in the sabotaging behaviors, essentially creating the path of least resistance in those first few stages of change, or those first few weeks or months of change. So I would say, from my perspective and what I specialize in more, a lot of the time people come to me thinking that they're sabotaging themselves, but actually they just haven't had the right tools to stay on track, to create momentum and start creating new pathways. I think we need to be excited about what we're moving towards. I think a lot of the time people think, oh, well, if I change, then I won't have this bad thing and I won't have that bad thing. But we normalize that really quickly. And I think that it isn't about isolating the one behavior and saying, this is a bad behavior and I've been bad because I can't change it, so I'm going to change this one behavior. I think a lot of the time, if we focus less on the behavior itself and more on building our self-esteem, self-belief, self-awareness, impulse control, mindfulness skills, then the habits start changing as a byproduct. I think when you zoom out, what you're able to do is see the way that a change would impact the other parts of your life positively and the knock-on impact it would have. And so you stop feeling like you're punishing yourself for being bad in one tiny area, and start feeling like you're generally doing an audit of your entire life and ways that you can feel better and have more self-belief and have more self-esteem and impulse control. And then it becomes a transferable skill regardless of the habit you want to change. Whereas when we zoom in and we just focus on the one habit specifically, even if we kind of remedy that, it's not that compelling as a mission, as an exciting personal development mission, to just remedy this one bad thing, as opposed to saying, you know what, I'm going to put myself on an ongoing low-level mission to like myself more, understand myself more every day. And whatever habits I want to change throughout my life will start changing more easily as a byproduct of that.
For just to summarize, because it's been really, really interesting speaking to you today. If somebody's listening and, they just want to change an unwanted behavior, maybe they want to spend less time on social media, maybe they want to change their career field or do something that they've always wanted to do, or just become more organized, what are some of your sort of final thoughts, maybe tips that you'd like to leave with our listeners about change and how they can change any unwanted behaviors?
When you're writing a plan, make sure that it's a plan based on who you are right now, not who you intend to be one day, your initial plan. So keep it realistic and base it on things that you've managed to do in the past. For example, I don't exercise in the morning. It makes me fall asleep. There are other people who absolutely do. Now, I've always wanted to be the sort of person who exercises in the morning, but I'm just not. Maybe one day I will be, but right now I'm not. So if I was creating a plan to say, start doing something like Couch to 5K, I wouldn't be doing it in the morning. So make the plan work for you, not the other way around. Number 2, expect that the plan will not always go to plan. the most important, anyone can follow a plan. The most important thing is how you decide you're going to behave when things don't go to plan. And a lot of the time people will say, well, then I don't know what to do. I'm off grid. I haven't got any rules. I haven't got any guidelines. And my answer to that is always just revert back to simple common sense. What would you tell your child to do if they were faced with this choice? And it's amazing how quickly that streamlines the decision-making process. The other thing is, when a habit comes along that you're not happy with, focus less on what's wrong with it and more on what's right with it. Because what you find then, let's say there's an unhealthy habit you're engaging in, and the negatives are outweighing positives, and so you want to change it. But you've established that that's a habit that makes you feel connected, it makes you feel grounded, it makes you feel calm, less stressed, it helps you escape. Those are your needs. Now, of course, we should always be trying to create a life for ourselves where possible we have less stress, or where possible we have less need to have those things remedied. But in the short term, if you focus on what's right about your habits and how they've served you, what you can get is some insight into what other habits you can put in place before you take the one that you're dependent on away. And that makes for a much softer landing than a sort of a punitive, being mean to yourself kind of thing. And the other thing I would say is, on that note about zooming out, hypothetical change. Do an exercise where you map out what things will look like in 6 months if you do change, and what they'll look like in 6 months if you don't change. Because in that moment when you want to throw in the towel, it can be very difficult to zoom out and remember all the other things that will be benefited or impacted negatively if you are to make this change, and all those knock-on things. And so I highly recommend that. And then just take a picture of the two of them. And whenever you start thinking, it's okay, I'll start on Monday, it doesn't matter, you'll remember that there are these two possible outcomes available to you, and that date is coming around whether you change or not. And it can be a very powerful tool for procrastination.
Really, really good. Thank you so much, Shahroo. If anybody wants to get in contact with you, how can we do that?
Website, shahrooizadi.com, Instagram, again, my name, Twitter, LinkedIn, just the internet.
Literally. She's everywhere.
Internet, just put my name into the internet.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your insights with us. And don't forget to get Shahroo's book as well, The Kindness Method, and also The Last Diet. And especially if you know somebody who's dealing with addiction or battling an addiction, this could be a really lovely gift for them as well. Thank you so much, Shahroo, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. That was lovely.
And we look forward to speaking to you again.
Colorful, Rochelle, Colorful Radio.